Good morning.
Morning.
It's the 18th of December, 2025, and we are in Washington, D.C. at the Army-Navy Club to interview Colonel Retired Jen Easterly. And my name is Scott Mythen with the Veterans Museum, and our videographer is Mike Galsky. So, ma'am, may I call you Jen?
Jen, please.
Okay, Jen. Thank you for sitting down with us to tell your story.
My pleasure.
And I know you went to West Point and served in the Army and then later went on to lots of jobs within multiple administrations, especially focusing on cyber defense. But if we can, let's start all the way at the very beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia at Lankenau Hospital and grew up in Overbrook Park until I was around 6 years old. And then we moved down to Potomac, Maryland.
So lots of family in the Philadelphia area?
You know, really it's just my dad now. My dad lives in Ardmore, moved from Potomac to Ocean City, New Jersey, and then settled in Ardmore on the main line.
And where were your parents from? Your dad was from Philly.
Well, my dad was from Philly. My mom was from Brooklyn, but did her PhD at Columbia and then was teaching in schools in Philadelphia. So was at Pennsylvania Military College, where she was my dad's professor, taught him English literature. She was at Temple University as well, and then at Bryn Mawr College when I was very young.
So your mother had a PhD in literature?
Yep, English literature.
So you read a lot of books when you were young?
I did read a lot of books. I think one thing that my parents both gave me from a very young age was a love of reading, a love of literature, and very specifically a love of poetry. They both particularly enjoyed poetry, and so, you know, I grew up memorizing poems, and poems have always played a significant role in my life, which is nice because of my parents.
That's amazing. So your parents met, you were born later. Any siblings?
Yeah, so my mom was previously married. My dad was as well. They met, they got married. My mom had two kids, my older half-brother, Justin, who lives in Los Angeles, and my older half-sister, Nikki, who lives in Israel. And then I had two younger brothers, one, Gabe, who lives in Dallas, and then one, Eli, who passed away.
Sorry to hear that. So everyone was living together? You know,
Yeah,
so
we all grew up together. I mean, there's a long age range
Right.
between my oldest brother and my youngest brother, so didn't necessarily all grow up together, but you know, we're in the house probably together at some point in time.
It sounds like a great childhood. When you were 6, you moved to Maryland?
To Maryland, yeah, to Potomac, Maryland.
Was that because of your parents' work?
Yeah, it's because my father had been commuting between Philadelphia and D.C. because he got a job working for the Postmaster General, a man called Red Blunt, who was from Alabama. And he was a speechwriter for him, and then was asked to be a speechwriter for President Nixon. And so ultimately they decided to move down. I think it was probably harder for my mom because she loved being a teacher at Bryn Mawr. But they all moved down and, you know, lived in a nice little suburb of D.C. out in Potomac, Maryland. And, yeah, I think it was certainly easier for my dad not to have to commute to Philly every weekend.
So had your father, prior to working for the Postmaster General, done any speech writing?
I don't know if he did, actually. You know, my father, that's his great gift. That's his superpower. He's an amazing, amazing writer. Beautiful way with words. And I think probably some of that is just because he's always been such a reader, right? My dad was a high school dropout. He grew up in kind of a difficult environment, you know, was adopted by a stepfather who treated him very, very badly. He ended up dropping out of high school, going to join the Army, enlisted, was ended up, I think his first assignment was in Germany, and then ended up in Vietnam. So, which was, again, for a very intellectually curious but pretty disaffected, in his early 20s, I think was actually a very, very positive experience. And that's one of the reasons that I think I was so inspired to serve, just hearing all the stories about his time in Vietnam, and then, of course, his later time working in the Defense Department for the Reagan administration.
What years did he serve in Vietnam?
He was there from 62 to 63, so it was pretty early on. He was, I want to say, the 33rd RRU, Radio Reconnaissance Unit. It was part of the Army Security Agency. And he worked out of Tan Son Nhut Air Force Base, but again, this was before there was a lot of violence there, so you could spend time in Saigon at the time and spend time getting to know the people and the culture and the food, and it was, ultimately, I think, a very positive experience for him. We got to go back together in 1999 after I gave up command at Fort Bragg. And before I went off to teach at West Point, there was about a 2-month period. So we took 3 weeks and spent time all over Vietnam, from the Mekong Delta to Saigon to Hoi An to Hue to Hanoi to Da Nang to Ha Long Bay, just basically making our way across the country. And it was one of, I think, the most special experiences that I've ever had, is getting to see a place that ultimately was very meaningful to him directly through my dad's eyes, and being able to go back to some of the places where he had a beer, or places where he visited, or places that were special for one reason or another. That was also a really inspiring opportunity.
That is fantastic, and a great parallel, because your father, you said reconnaissance, was it military intelligence?
Yeah, it was intel. It was intel, exactly. I think it was communications intelligence. So he would talk about some of the reports that he sent back to Fort Meade, which I was later stationed at. I think he later found out that they didn't do anything with his reports. They somehow got sort of filed in the, I don't think it was necessarily the circular file, but I think it was sort of filed in some room where much of it wasn't really used, but notwithstanding, I think it was an important experience for him.
And I think that's amazing that you and your father got to take that trip and revisit that for him while you were active duty military intelligence.
Yeah, it was great. And actually, based on that trip that we took in, I want to say probably December of 1999. So I started teaching at West Point in January of 2000, and then ended up that summer taking midshipmen and cadets back on virtually that same trip in Vietnam to sort of study economic development in Vietnam. So it was kind of fun. We sort of followed almost the same path.
Right. Okay, so let's jump back to, you moved to Potomac, Maryland, and was that kind of rural in the 70s or
no,
suburb?
It was like very suburbs. It was a decent place. I don't, it was all sort of public schools, nice kind of, relatively quiet neighborhoods where you rode bikes and played tennis and, went swimming and things like that. I mean, it was your sort of typical suburban lifestyle.
How did you do in school?
I ended up doing well in school. I was, for my high school class, everybody who got a 4.0 was a, valedictorian. So I was one of the whatever valedictorians in our class of, I don't even remember how many people, several hundred. The only one that applied and ended up going to West Point. But I have to say, like, I wasn't particularly, even though I did well, I wasn't particularly academic. I don't know how hard I necessarily worked. There were certain things that I really enjoyed. I was the arts editor for our school newspaper. But I think I was always sort of striving to figure out, where I was going to be able to make a difference in the world, which is why I think I chose a different path. Most of the folks who I graduated with, went off and went to Ivy League schools and had pretty distinguished careers as lawyers and doctors and things like that. But I think I was, always kind of looking at a bit of a different path.
What sort of activities were you involved with when you were younger?
I always, was athletic for a while, but I didn't really play a bunch of sports. I did some travel. I was an exchange student in Italy. I worked. It was important to me to actually have some source of my own money. So I started off, my first job was scooping ice cream at Baskin-Robbins when I was 14. And I worked in a bank. That's how I made the money to pay for the exchange program to Italy. So the Potomac Community Federal Credit Union, I was a teller. And then I was a tutor. I taught Hebrew at a Hebrew school, and I was very active in that community as well. I grew up in a conservative Jewish household. My mom had been Orthodox. Her father was a rabbi. But when my father had to convert to marry my mom, and then we grew up not in an Orthodox household, although we were kosher, but grew up conservative, and so went to synagogue and went to Israel for my little brother's bar mitzvah, and yeah.
And I know you've told stories in some of you do a lot of speaking engagements. Tell me about the Rubik's Cube, please.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I brought one with me, actually.
Yeah?
Yeah. Can I get it?
Sure.
Yeah. Let's see. When I was growing up, we had the kind of family that played all kinds of games. My mom in particular, we used to sit around playing all these board games. Back in the day, it was like Scrabble and Sorry and just Monopoly and Candyland. I remember when I was super young, and so all kinds of board games and card games, checkers and chess. And then I loved video games. I grew up in the age of Atari, if you remember, like very early days. And so, and the little Game Boys and all of that. So, when you ask me what I did when I was young, was probably playing a lot of games, going to the arcade, playing a bunch of Pac-Man, Miss Pac-Man. But I also love puzzles. And so when the Rubik's Cube came out, Rubik's Cube was invented by Hungarian sculptor Erno Rubik in the year 1974, but it didn't go commercially until 1980 when I was 11. And it was released into the world, and I immediately was sort of obsessed with solving it. And of course, this was pre-internet, pre-YouTube days. And so there wasn't like, oh, you can look at the video and figure out how to solve it. So it actually took me quite a while to figure out how to solve it. But I finally got it, under 2 minutes, right? So I would go around to toy stores. We used to travel in the area and, make a bet. It was all brick and mortar toy stores with the clerk or the owner, if I could solve this Rubik's Cube in less than 2 minutes, can you give me a free one? And now, of course, you can go on YouTube today and see a 2-year-old girl solving the Rubik's Cubes with her toes in 19 seconds, but back then 2 minutes was a pretty big deal. So I ended up amassing like a nice little collection of Rubik's Cubes that I have to this day. And it was actually really an important experience in my life because it taught me a lot about just defying some of the stereotypes. How these clerks and owners were sort of looking at this little girl with pigtails, like solving this seemingly incredibly complex puzzle. And so it was a defying stereotype, setting, expectations, and this whole idea of, imagination, which is something that I've carried with me throughout my whole life, that if you can imagine something, you can achieve it. And so I always love thinking about the Rubik's Cube as kind of like a symbol for on so many different levels. And the idea of imagination shows up at different times in my career. But let's see, I can solve that. But one of the things that I did at CISA was we created the CISA cube, which was basically a cube with a CISA seal on it. And the whole idea was, so Erno Rubik has this great quote, which is, if you are curious, you will find the puzzles around you. If you are determined, you will solve them. And that was really, it was emblematic of the type of person we were trying to hire at America's Cyber Defense Agency, somebody who's very intellectually curious, but also has that innate determination to be able to deal with some of the, the most difficult and complex puzzles in the world. So.
And you were confident in your abilities as an 11-year-old. So you must have spent hours working with the cube.
Yeah.
But then you were able to walk into a store and more or less, as an 11-year-old, right, 5th or 6th grader, challenge the established leaders.
Yeah, I guess if you think about it as the established leaders, I was, I think people, like back then, they didn't know about, people were just amazed at these, like how difficult these things were. And so, yeah, it was a little bit of kind of a Rubik's Cube hustler at a very young age. But I think about the story now and it kind of just makes me laugh. But in my elementary school, I would say the one teacher that had the most favorable impact on me in the public school that I went to was my 5th grade teacher, sort of that year. It was a guy called Josh Cooper. And I just remember he was somebody who gave me this sort of sense of, like, you can do anything you want in life. And so I was probably wrapped up into it, the fact that I thought I could kind of just waltz into the local toy store and actually solve the cube in less than 2 minutes.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, so you mentioned applying for West Point Military Academy. And I know you need a congressional endorsement.
Yes.
Is that right?
You do, yeah. And I got mine from a guy called Mike Barnes, who was in the 8th District of Maryland at the time. I forget whether I interviewed with him or what it was all about, but ended up applying early, got accepted early, and decided that's what I wanted to do. I sort of knew I wanted to do it from a young age, but I think the one mistake that I made was I never visited the school, and so I found myself pretty ill prepared for what I was going to encounter on our day, reception day, 1 July of 1986. I remember a blistering hot day, and they brought everybody, all the new cadets, into, I think it was the hockey rink at the time, and they tell you, say goodbye to your parents, and then you enter like a long hallway, and you have to give up all your clothes. You put on these sort of a white T-shirt, some acrylic, horrible shorts, and black socks that you have to take up to your knees, and these horribly uncomfortable black patent leather shoes, and hack your hair off. And I wasn't in the shape that I should have been. So my first PT test, I think I failed the 2-mile run, didn't do many push-ups, didn't do many sit-ups, and so it was, I was really physically, mentally, emotionally, probably terribly, terribly prepared for that experience. So it's somewhat amazing that I was able to successfully make it through, but I guess I did.
And in '86, it had just been 10 years before when women were first admitted to West Point. Is that right? 76?
So 76, yeah. So I got there, July, so 10 years. So yeah, and there were still a lot of even cadets, professors, staff that I think would have been happy not to have women there, and so it made it, I think even more difficult. And women were, I don't have the exact stats, I think we started out with about 135, somewhere between 135, 150 women, and we ended up with about 89. So there was a pretty high attrition rate. And, you know, there was a pretty high attrition rate for men in those days. There's so many ways that you can leave West Point, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily. But yeah, it was very, very challenging. And, you know, I had to do everything I could not to quit. And that was a lot of just using what I had taken from growing up, you know, believing in myself, imagining myself getting successfully through Beast Barracks, getting successfully through my plebe year, and so was able to stick with it. But yeah, there were times where I definitely thought that I just wanted to go home and start over again somewhere.
Would you call home in those moments?
Yeah, but those were, so it wasn't easy to do in those days, right? It was phone booths down in the basement where, you know, you had limited time to do that. And I also didn't want to be the person calling to sort of, you know, whine and complain about things. And so, but yeah, I would call. And I even remember the first time I think I got to see my dad was maybe Thanksgiving. He came to visit. And yeah, I mean, it was definitely a challenging environment. But I'm glad that ultimately I went there, and proud that I made it through. And I think, you know, gave me a lot of what has helped me achieve whatever success I've been able to achieve in life. Was really started with the discipline, the personal rigor, the developing confidence in myself, the understanding how to be a good leader or not be a good leader, the good examples and the bad examples. And then, you know, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing about West Point is just the values, right? The values of duty and honor and country, and, you know, what's engraved on the cadet prayer about always choosing the harder right over the easier wrong. I think those are the most enduring things that I bring with me, you know, from having gone to West Point and having, you know, later taught there.
I know from my time working at the Naval Academy that cadet summer is normally managed by the upperclassmen.
Yeah.
So how were the women in your year group received by the upperclassmen, and were there any female leaders in the upperclassmen cadre?
Yeah, there were, but I don't remember any of them being particularly, like, helpful in any way. I don't remember any female officers being particularly helpful. I remember one male cadet being particularly unhelpful. And so it was really figuring out, you know, how to make my way. One of the things that I did was I joined the Jewish chapel choir. And that was a helpful thing because you would go to this, they had just built this beautiful chapel up on the hill, and you could go there on Friday night and have bagels.
Yeah.
And of course, as a plebe, you weren't eating anything because they, you know, that was one of the things, is you really didn't get to have a lot of food. And so it was nice on a Friday evening to get and be around other folks. And it wasn't all Jews, you know, it was people who wanted to be part of that community. And so that was really nice, actually.
That's amazing. So you had connections. Did you develop a group of friends that, you know, you studied with, worked out with, managed through all these difficulties with?
Yeah, I had a few core friends, and it changed over the years. But the person who was my best friend is still my best friend to this day, and still incredibly close. She was also graduated my year and went off to be a military police officer, ended up getting out of the Army in 3 years, actually. A lot of folks got out before their commitment because of the peace dividend with the wall coming down, and went off to Stanford Business School, and is now in New York. And so, and then, you know, after I graduated from West Point, I went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and there was 3 other West Pointers with me, and then a Naval Academy grad. And those were actually among my very closest friends, and folks that to this day I still am very, very close with. So yeah, it was interesting and kind of unexpected. but nice.
Those are great connections. So you made it past that second year mark. You're definitely staying in and staying Army.
I mean, once I made it through plebe year, I figured, well, the toughest stuff is over. And then, I was doing pretty well academically, so that was good. I joined the lacrosse team. I hadn't played lacrosse before, but I wanted to try it, and so I was able to pick that up. I studied Russian, which was something that was of great interest to me because, of course, I entered during the Cold War, and so I thought that might be a useful thing. When I left West Point, the Cold War was basically over, so it was less useful. But my mom, when she left government, she was an assistant secretary of housing and urban development in the Reagan administration. She left government and started her own consulting practice that worked in Russia. So she had offices in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and she taught herself fluent Russian. And so it was actually kind of cool. I went with her to Russia in '92, and being able to speak with her a little bit was kind of cool. So Russia, and then things got easier after plebe year.
And I understand you did an internship because in the summer, the cadets do training missions, right? They go out and experience Army life.
Plebe, you're plebe your first summer, then you're in what's called Camp Buckner your second summer, and then your third summer. Gosh, what did I do? I went to air assault school. This was going into my junior year. Went to air assault school, and I can't even recall what else I did. But I then went, I was an exchange cadet, so went to the Air Force Academy for a semester in Colorado Springs. And then my last summer, I did sort of the 7-week internship. There were very few internships in those days. There are many more now. But there was one internship that was at Mons, which was Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in Belgium. And so showed up there, and I think I was assigned somebody to like a senior master sergeant in the Air Force to work with him, but they had me sort of doing some research on Jane's defense reviews and things like that wasn't very purposeful, and I ended up running into this lieutenant colonel at the time, a guy named Jim McDonough, who was class of '69 from West Point, and who had written a pretty famous book that was required reading for all cadets. It was Platoon Leader. It was about his time in Vietnam. And sort of ran into him, and he asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm just, I'm doing some research projects, and he asked me if I wanted to come sort of be an intern in his office, which was the office of the SACEUR, John Galvin. And that turned out to be really transformative, and I ended up writing a paper about the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of the sort of political, economic conditions that was leading to the end of communism. And, Colonel McDonough ended up writing me a recommendation for my Rhodes application, and actually ended up commissioning me when I graduated on the 31st of May, 1990. So that, was unexpected but super special. And that summer I actually traveled all over, did a ton of reading, traveled to Oxford for the first time and saw just the incredible beauty of Oxford, and that's what really cemented my desire to apply for the Rhodes, was walking around Christchurch Meadow in July of 1989.
You were already thinking about the Rhodes application?
I was sort of thinking about it, but I think I was not considered a serious candidate in any way. It was interesting. I think they saw me as the very, very dark horse candidate. I was a little bit, I did well in school, but I was perhaps a little irreverent. I was not always the best with authority, despite the fact that I was in the military for a very long time. So I don't think they saw me as the perfect cadet or as the ideal candidate for a Rhodes Scholarship. So that was sort of the long and winding road to actually getting it, but it worked out okay.
So you had McDonough's recommendation, were there any other faculty or mentors at West
Yeah,
Point?
I'm sure there were. I mean, there were folks in what's called the SOC Department of Social Sciences, which is economics, American politics, and international relations. And so, you know, at West Point, everybody gets a Bachelor of Science degree. You can do something called a field of study, where you can take some electives in that area in your junior and senior year. It's not a ton, frankly, because every cadet has to take all kinds of engineering and maths and chemistry and physics. But I took a couple of these classes that I really enjoyed, and the professors that I recall, there was a Major Russ Howard, who was great, who later became the head of the department. There was a Lieutenant Colonel Dan Kaufman, who later became the head of the SOC department. So they were all very supportive and encouraging and really kind of believed in me, which was cool. And Major Howard was actually the teaching assistant for, we had somebody who was called an Olin, it was like an endowed professorship. And the first Olin professor was a retired admiral, former CIA director, Stan Turner, who was Jimmy Carter's classmate. And so it was very cool as a senior having Stan Turner as our professor. He taught a class on terrorism. You know, this was in 1989 when sort of there was a lot of terrorism, but it wasn't, you know, people weren't riveted on it like they were post 9/11. But he also took my essay that I wrote for the Rhodes Scholarship, and I still have it, like his comments that he wrote on it. I still have a copy of his handwritten comments, but he was super helpful and encouraging because he'd been a Rhodes and gone to Exeter College, and then he came and visited me when I was at Oxford. So yeah, it was sort of nice, all these things coming together.
And I'm guessing around the same time, you're also getting the opportunity to select which community in the Army you're going to serve in.
Yeah.
What were your choices?
I mean, there weren't as many choices as there are today with women able to serve in the combat arms, but, you know, MI was popular, MPs was popular, engineer, aviation. My best friend, CJ, went military intelligence, or military police, and I ended up in MI. I don't know. I didn't know that much about it, to be honest. It just sounded something that was interesting. You know, some of the stories you hear about how intelligence made a difference in World War II. So I put in for MI, and, you know, it actually turned out to be a very, very good decision. But it was, I wouldn't say it was random, but it wasn't this well thought out decision. It was just, that sounded very interesting to me, and so I'm going to go for it.
And still, like, under the surface was the connection with, that's what your father had done in the
Yeah,
Army.
I guess, but you know, I didn't naturally make that connection. My father had served in the Army. Later on, probably around the time that we went together to Vietnam, I understood a little bit more about him serving with what was the radio reconnaissance unit, sort of the same sort of signals intelligence that I had done with the Army Security Agency. And so that ended up being, again, like this happy coincidence. And, you know, as I might have mentioned earlier, what Einstein talks about, you know, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. So, you know, who knows how these kind of parallel connections happen in life. But yeah, I don't remember choosing MI because of my father's service, but, you know, the connectivity later in life was something that was special.
Were your parents and your family able to come to graduation commissioning?
Yeah, absolutely. My whole family came. My mom's stepmom, grandma. I don't know if maybe my other grandmother, my father. So grandparents were there. My little brother was there. But yeah, my parents were there. It was really nice. I still have these lovely, lovely pictures of a very, very, very hot day in Mikey Stadium. And then, you know, I was commissioned, the top of the class get our diploma from the graduation speaker. who at the time was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell. So I have this, one of my favorite photos is getting my diploma and my commissioning handed to me by Colin Powell, who then I later had interacted with when I worked for Condi Rice, and he was the Secretary of State. And I have another great picture of him sort of that he signed for me as a present, sort of, you know, like telling me how terrible my salute was as a young major, which is pretty funny. But he's always been like a great hero of mine, mentor of mine. Yeah, so again, these kind of connections that happen in life are special. But yeah, my family was there, and then we went down to place by the Thayer Hotel, and that's where Jim McDonough commissioned me. So it was another special time.
So the connection you made during that internship between junior and senior year with Colonel McDonough, was he already planning on coming to your graduation, or?
No. I mean, that's how I met him, and I asked him if he would. So, yeah, I don't know if he even, I mean, he was stationed in, I think he was still stationed in Belgium at the time. It was a year later, but anyway, he was there. It was lovely.
That's fantastic. So you were selected to be a Rhodes Scholar, and you mentioned there were a handful of others from the service academies. So how many?
Well, there was one other woman, Carolyn Ford, who was selected for a Rhodes, and then two other men, Ned Hoyt and Mike Thorson, who were selected for a Marshall Scholarship. And then there was a guy called Kurt Beyer, who he and I had been at the same set of interviews. And this guy looked like he was right out of Top Gun. I mean, he looked like, I think the character was like Slider out of Top Gun, like 6 foot something, like gorgeous, like literally right out of Central Casting. That guy's going to get the scholarship. And so when he didn't get it, everybody was sort of shocked. And I had, in a very short period of time, become like very friendly with this terrific guy. Interestingly, we had both shown up to the interviews. So before an interview, you'd go to a state interview, and if you get past your state, you go to a district. And we both showed up at the district, which is at the University of Pennsylvania. And it was a terrible snowstorm that day. It was like December, I forget what, it was the same day as the Army-Navy game that year. And we both showed up after having been in car wrecks. My parents had insisted that they were going to drive me to Philadelphia as opposed to me getting on the Amtrak, which would have been much smarter. Like my dad, like, no, we have the Audi, and the Audi is, you know, nothing could go wrong with the Audi. And then about halfway through, we're spinning off the road, ended up in a ditch, nearly got plowed by an 18-wheeler. But by miracle, I made it on time to the interview, and you know, Kurt was there, and he'd been in a car wreck as well. And so both of us really were not that interested in, you know, doing the cocktail party thing, and really just spent time getting to know each other. Although that the president of the board was this wonderful, wonderful man named Father Tim Healy, who had been the president of Georgetown University and was now the president of the New York Public Library. This amazing Jesuit priest, who, and I don't know if I have the memory right, but you know, this is back in late 80s, so he sort of had a cigarette in one hand and like a Dixie cup that he was flicking the ashes in, and then like a bourbon in the other. And but he loved Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was this poet that was one of my favorites, that had been one of my mom's favorite. And so I could quote all these like amazing Hopkins poems, like the poem Spring and Fall, Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove and leaving? And that's how we sort of bonded. And so I think my Rhodes interview, was much easier than most, because I had connected with this guy, so we just talked about poetry. But Kurt and I ended up drawing the first 2 interviews the next morning. And so I had my interview, he had his interview, and then there were like another, whatever it was, 16 people. So Kurt and I ended up playing like rounds and rounds of backgammon and just struck up this great friendship. And then he didn't get the scholarship. And so when I arrived at Oxford that first day, and we were at the bar, the pub that everybody goes to, the King's Arms, and Kurt was there, and I was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? He's like, well, I got the Fitzgerald Scholarship. And so so he ended up at Brasenose College with Mike, who was another West Pointer, Darren Marshall, Matt Pinsker, who was another one of our very close friends who was there from Harvard, and then I was at Pembroke. And so, my best friends from Oxford, separate from my best girlfriend, Kirkland, we're still very, very close to this day.
Love that. And everyone at Oxford goes for the same master's, is that correct?
Well, all of us, back in those days, everybody pretty much did what's called PB&E, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. It's different now, but it was essentially a 3-year degree that we did in 2 years, and it's sort of the equivalent of a master's. So you start out with a BA, but it matures into an MA Oxon. And so we all did PP&E. I will confess I was not the most academic person. I had done very well at West Point, graduated 8th in my class out of 1,000, whatever. But at Oxford, I was much more about traveling and spending time, with friends, sort of reading, exploring the world. Oxford was much more about how to think as opposed to, what to think. And so I ended up doing okay. I wasn't a stellar student, but it was a wonderful experience. I focused on economics and philosophy, and then did a lot of travel, spent my summer between the 2 years in Indonesia, sort of traveling around the island of Sulawesi with a bunch of medical researchers, trekking, and it was just like a fantastic experience.
That's great. Was it an easy transition from being at West Point in uniform in classes being taught by active duty personnel and being in a rigid, military training environment and moving into, a relaxed civilian mindset at Oxford College?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was a hard transition. I mean, it was kind of cool to be able to do that. I think that was a more challenging transition to go from Oxford back to the U.S. Army, where I wasn't sure that I was really that excited to go into the Army. And so my military intelligence officer basic course in Fort Huachuca, I think I was a little resistant to all of the basic concepts at the time. I was more interested in, I was learning how to fly, and staying fit and all those types of things. And so I certainly wasn't the best student in my officer basic course. So that was a bit of a challenging transition. But then ended up going to Hawaii to the 25th Infantry Division, and that turned out to be a wonderful experience. Young second lieutenant, living up on the north shore of Hawaii, first in Haleiwa by Pipeline Beach, and then in Wailua, and a series of really, interesting roles as a platoon leader in the 125 MI Battalion, then as what was called an IEWSO, an Intelligence Electronic Warfare Support Officer in 2nd Brigade of the 25th Infantry Division, where we deployed to Haiti. That was surprisingly a very formative experience for me, because I actually, most of my classmates had gotten out, because you get out at the 3-year mark. And I was actually looking to go to Johns Hopkins to do an MD PhD. That was sort of the path that I was very interested in, and was going to get engaged and to a lieutenant that I'd met in Hawaii. And then I ended up getting stationed in Haiti, and this was a part of Operation Uphold Democracy. This was the return of Aristide, who had been ousted in a coup. And it was a fantastic experience, because I was really using my skills as a military intelligence officer and my understanding of politics. A lot of what I did was briefing the military officers on the elections that were happening on the ground in Haiti. And I felt like, oh, this is really about using my skills in a place where I can make a difference. It was a little bit of an analog of how my father felt when he was in Vietnam. And that really was the reason why I decided to stay in the Army. So came back from Haiti, was a battalion logistics officer that was very unhappy about. That turned out to be a fantastic experience, because, as they say, logistics are for professionals, tactics are for amateurs. So that was actually a very good experience. And then after that, I went off to the advanced course.
So you more or less proved to yourself that you had made a great choice.
Yeah, ultimately. I mean, I think when you're young and, all these things are happening, you don't really recognize that, oh, I'd made a great choice. But I think ultimately I really felt like the deployment and being able to use the skills in an actual operational environment was a very sort of positive thing about how you can make an impact in the world. And so that turned out to be, I think, a validation of a lot of the things that I'd taken with me that was from when I was very young, in terms of if you can imagine yourself doing something, you can achieve it.
So your second unit, military intelligence, was it at Fort Bragg?
Yeah, Fort Bragg. Fort Bragg, yeah. I got there, really had to fight hard to get there. Fort Bragg was like the place to be, particularly if, as a company commander, which was, the way it worked in those days. Your first assignment as a lieutenant, you're a platoon leader, then you go on as a captain and hopefully command a company. So I was able to get to Fort Bragg. I show up at 525 MI Brigade. I think I was an assistant S3 I started out. Or working in, gosh, I don't remember. But yeah, it was some very junior staff officer, not doing anything of much consequence, frankly. And then I'm trying to remember. The next major memory I have was, I really wanted to command a company because I'd been to Oxford, I was a little more senior than most of my peers, and I felt okay, now that I've made the decision, I'm not going to go off and be a doctor. I really want to try this thing and be successful. And I think I'd had mentors or had this feeling that if you are a successful company commander and you enjoy doing that, that bodes well for you having a long and productive career. And so I felt very like this urgency to command. And so I put together, I remember, I probably still have it, this like little brown folio with my little West Point sticker, JM, my maiden name was Cook, JM Cook 90, and it had my resume and things in it. And I made an appointment with the brigade commander at the time, an office call. And it was a guy called Keith Alexander, Colonel Keith Alexander, who had a very good reputation and somebody who was being very, very, very smart. He was class of 74, sort of one of the, superstars in the MI world. And so made this, appointment, and I was setting myself up for all the reasons why I needed to go command. I think it was a Bravo Company 319th MI Battalion. I picked the one, and I had all of the arguments. And so I went in, and I showed him this folio, and I can't imagine what he was thinking at the time. Sat down and kind of laid out my whole argument, and he's like, well, thank you very much. I've actually already chosen somebody to command that company. And it was my classmate, Susie Nielsen. And I was like, oh, okay, well, thank you for the time, sir. And I was slinking out of the office, and I get to the door. I'm walking out. He's like, but you know what? I might have an opportunity for you. And he said, are you interested in being an S2, which is an intelligence officer? And I said, yes, sir. He's like, well, I have a friend who is the commander of the aviation regiment, and they're going to Bosnia. I said, well, I'd love to interview for that job. And so ended up being the S2 for the 229th Aviation Regiment, which is quite a storied unit that sort of traced its history back to if you read Hal Moore's We Were Soldiers Once and Young, the 229th Aviation Company, and back to the Flying Tigers, Claire Chennault. And so it was the Flying Tigers, and the commander was a guy called Duz Packett, Virgil, but he goes by Duz, who was literally like the guy out of Apocalypse Now who's on the beach with the cigar. And I was S2, so I was Tiger 2. Was in Bosnia with them for 6 months, and it was as the S2 for an aviation regiment, and our main mission was reconnaissance and surveillance as part of the PIFWIC mission, terrible acronym, persons indicted for war crimes. It was going after the people who had committed these horrible crimes against within the Yugoslav war, so Radovan Karadzic and Slobodan Milosevic, and so was sort of helping to plan out the reconnaissance and surveillance missions, and was another amazing opportunity to use skills in a specific operational environment where you can have an impact at, then, as a Regiment S2 task force, as Task Force 2, it was like a very positive experience. So, and then after that, I was able to come back, and Alexander had left, a new guy came in, but was able to go into a different company, not the one I had originally been interested in, but go into Charlie Company, 319th MI Battalion. That was an amazing company that focused on like imagery intelligence, and that turned out to be a fantastic experience as well, being a company commander, and realized that I did really like being in the Army. And so again, after the second operational deployment, and then also Fort Bragg is a lot of about camaraderie, and so had been to jump master school and got my senior parachutist, and all those fun experiences when you're a very young officer in very good shape in those days. And so again, very super positive experience. But when I think about somebody who has made a major impact on me throughout my career, it would be General Alexander, retired General Alexander, but he would show up in other places in my career. That would be like a great mentor.
And that's the same colonel that you brought the outline and the plan.
Yeah, he was at my retirement ceremony. I actually brought that story up. I think he did not remember it at all, but it stayed very much in my memory.
Well, tell us about, forming working relationships with senior enlisted soldiers and junior enlisted soldiers.
Yeah, within my company, we had these amazing folks. We had warrant officers back then, and then a lot of folks like Sergeant Salen, Sergeant Isgreg, Sergeant Oyinlade, warrant officer, Brian Shrout, who became a warrant officer, Willie Malave, my first sergeants, Jeff Wood. So yeah, it was actually kind of cool. Like, I think I didn't recognize, and then even when I was in S2, I had some like great folks back then. Eric Broom. Can't remember all their names, but yeah, it was great, particularly in operational environments, developing the kind of team that when you're working whatever it is, 18 hours a day, can actually hang together and get a mission done. But I would say, my whole career has been an evolution in how I can be a better leader. I don't think as a platoon leader I was a particularly good leader. I think I got better as a company commander, but then learned a lot from those experiences, had mentors that helped me be a better leader. I don't think I had any great examples when I was a cadet. I think that was a little bit in survival mode when I was a cadet. And so it was really like, I think the first person when I was at Fort Bragg was really Colonel Alexander at the time, and then Colonel Packett, who was a great leader when I was a Task Force S2. But it was really kind of learning how to be a better leader in different situations.
Well, it sounds like you had a myriad of amazing experiences at that tour at Fort Bragg. So what followed that? Was it back to West Point?
Yeah, after I gave up committee command, went on that trip with my dad to Vietnam, and then went to West Point to teach. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I actually looked at a bunch of different things, but had this opportunity to go back to West Point directly. January of 2000, was there for 2.5 years, was supposed to teach international relations, but actually was thrown in to teach economics because I'd studied economics at Oxford. So ended up teaching economics, advanced economics, international economics, and then was chosen to be the teaching assistant for interestingly, the next iteration of the Olin professor, right? I was the student for the first Olin professor, Stan Turner, when I was an instructor. So it was in 2000, was it 2000? Yeah, so I got there in January that summer, went back to Vietnam with the midshipmen and the cadets along with a teacher from the Naval Academy. So that was also phone. So got back, and I was asked by the head of the department, who was then Colonel Howard, who had been Major Howard, would I be the teaching assistant for the incoming Olin professor, who was a guy called Barry McCaffrey. So McCaffrey was the youngest and most highly decorated officer of his generation when he retired. So he retired probably less than 50 as the Southcom commander and was Bill Clinton's drug czar. And then after drug czar, after the head of ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, he was chosen to be the Olin professor. Now McCaffrey, who I didn't know, only knew him by reputation, very storied reputation, one of the most courageous fighters in Vietnam, several tours there, very, very badly wounded, Distinguished Service Cross. He had a reputation of being the meanest general in the entire U.S. Army. People used to brief him and faint because he was so mean. And he had this reputation that was well known. And so I was like, why do you want me to do this job? But I took some advice from some people and decided to do it. And he turned out to be, I'm still very, very close with him. It was one of the best experiences to get to work with General McCaffrey. He was one of the funniest, one of the most just wonderful, wonderful humans on the planet. And getting to spend time with him and his wife Jill, and getting to be his TA. He was an amazing, amazing mentor to me, and then all of the students who I still stay in touch with from our classes, and we still talk about our days with McCaffrey. And he taught a class on national security decision-making using the Gulf War, because he had been a hero of the Gulf War, the commander of the 24th and the left hook. So I started teaching, being his TA in the, I want to say probably beginning in January of 2001. So we had our first iteration, and then going into our second class was when 9/11 happened. And that was an incredible time to be at West Point working with him, because he's of course been in battle in many, many scenarios. So, a lot of folks actually looked to him to sort of kind of help interpret what was happening post 9/11 as we went to war in Afghanistan. And so that was an incredible experience as well. And then was there until, so teaching in that fall of 2001 after 9/11, and I was supposed to go off to CGSC at Newport, and then was planning on going to Korea. But that December of 2001, December 4th, my little brother took his life. And so I ended up, instead of going off to another operational unit, I applied. West Point, the social department actually really sort of supported me through this whole thing, as did McCaffrey. So applying for a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, because I needed to get to DC to help my parents. So, they help with all these recommendations from former social people like Dave Petraeus and Jack Reed and Dan Kaufman, and so got this fellowship. Ended up then having to figure out how to get a job, because you get the fellowship, that's a vehicle, but you have to actually place yourself somewhere. So one of my Rhodes Scholar classmates from Oxford, a great guy, Joel Shin, who sadly passed away a few years ago, had been on the campaign for George W. Bush. So he knew Condi Rice, he knew Steve Hadley, and he was able to set me up to do an interview with them, because they were looking for an executive assistant to be in the National Security Advisor's front office. And so as part of that, I interviewed with Steve and with Condi, and ended up being the executive assistant, first for Steve Hadley, the Deputy National Security Advisor, and then after a year moved on to be the executive advisor, or executive assistant, senior policy advisor for the National Security Advisor, which is Condoleezza Rice. So, and was there during a pretty formative time. So think about it, I got there summer of 2002. That phase of the war in Afghanistan was sort of drawing to a close, and then the case was being made for the war in Iraq. And then, less than a year later, March of 2003, we would go to war in Iraq, and I was there until the summer of 2004. So was with Dr. Rice as she testified before the 9/11 Commission hearing.
So you were in the room when it happened, all those pivotal moments, but you were also close to home, so you could be there for family.
Yeah, that was the whole point of getting to DC, as opposed to going off to Newport or going off to another operational assignment. That was a really important thing because, as you can imagine, my parents were pretty devastated, and I was the child that was the closest, and also had been very, very close with my little brother. So, obviously the work at the White House was pretty intense as well, very, very long days, but the fact that they were there within like a half an hour was away, and I could see them quite often was really important.
Did you live in DC or?
I lived in DC, yeah, I lived in Pentagon City. But again, my parents were in Rockville by that point in time, so like half an hour away, and saw them very, very often, which was nice.
In your career, were there more like amazing moments where you realized you were, on the precipice of important things happening? And
as I look back and you kind of remember things in snapshots, like either pictures that you saved or sort of moments that stayed in your brain because they were so consequential. So I remember the morning when Saddam Hussein was, captured, and very snowy day. My boyfriend at the time drove me into the White House to get there so we could have the reporting. And I remember the day we went to war in Iraq. It was the only day that I wore my uniform because you wear civilian clothes. But I remember, traveling on Air Force One to the Azores, where that second resolution ended up being pulled down after the discussion with the other key UN Security Council partners. So it was some of these moments, but I also just remember some moments being there with friends, some of our close friends in the front office, and spending time with both, Steve Hadley and Condi Rice, who to this day remain incredible mentors to me. That was a very formative time, particularly seeing how two incredibly smart, dedicated, capable, and very gracious humans dealt with incredible stressors, during a time where we thought there was going to be another attack on the nation.
Your father had worked for the Nixon administration?
He was a speechwriter in the Nixon administration, but then he was in the Reagan administration as a principal deputy assistant secretary for international security affairs, and then specifically focused on Africa. And then he was the first, what was called the director of special planning, so a position that later became the assistant secretary of defense for special operations, low intensity conflicts. So was very involved in rebuilding special operations capability in the aftermath of Desert One, the failed Iran hostage rescue mission. And so that was also something that, was very, came up in my life, where I ultimately did a lot in the counterterrorism world post 9/11. Most of my deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan were about counterterrorism. And then I was the deputy for counterterrorism at the National Security Agency, my first job as a senior civilian at Fort Meade, and then went to the White House to be the special assistant to President Obama and senior director for counterterrorism. So, these were all sort of notes that were present, kind of a string that was pulled throughout my life, kind of inspired by the work that I saw my father doing.
And again, some more parallels. Your father working for the administrations, you also working for the administrations.
Yep.
Were you a major at this time? When you were senior policy advisor?
Oh, working for Condi?
Yes.
Yeah, I was a major. Mm-hmm. Yep, I was a major. And then I think I'd been promoted probably just about a year before I was a major. And then after I left the White House, I went to Fort Meade and later got promoted to lieutenant colonel. I got frocked, actually, to go to Iraq.
Well, I have to ask, you're over the 10-year mark. Were you planning on staying for a full 20?
Yeah, I thought that's always the thing. Like if you decide you get past that 10-year mark, I sort of thought that I was, because you feel like you're successful as a company commander, then you want to go on and do your, back then, I think all the nomenclature has probably changed, but, BQ jobs, branch qualifications. So left the White House, didn't end up going to Command and General Staff College. I was supposed to go to Newport. My branch reps, I remember the colonel at the time was kind of a jerk who said, well, if you don't go to CGSC and you stay another year at the White House, you'll be, your career will be a failure, all of that. Well, okay. But my career advice is always ignore your branch rep. So ended up, it was exactly the right thing, and an opportunity to work for the National Security Advisor during the most consequential time. Of course I was going to stay because she wanted me to stay. So then went to Fort Meade, and was the battalion XO for the 742nd MI Battalion and the 704th MI Brigade, the largest MI brigade in the Intelligence and Security Command. Got there in 04, I believe. Yeah, 04. And then to 05, and then in 05 was chosen to be the Brigade S3 for the 704th to Colonel Dennis Thornton, good guy. And I believe in 2005, a guy called Keith Alexander became the director of NSA, and our paths then converged again.
So you were in an active duty unit at Fort Meade. Were you integrated with civilians, or was it completely Army?
No, it was pretty military at the time, and most of my work, because it was staff work as a chief of staff, battalion XO and S3. S3 was more operational, but it was still about how are we staffing the National Security Agency, right? NSA is NSA CISA, Central Security Service, and so the military part of the National Security Agency, and so we were the big force supplier for the NSA mission. But a lot of my stuff was like, how do we man, train, and equip to enable our folks to do that, as opposed to necessarily being deep in the operational mission. Which is why, that's after I left the S3 job, I applied to be what was called the CSG, the Cryptologic Services Group Chief, which was kind of the premier position in Baghdad at the time, the head of all the forces, all forces and civilians in Baghdad. And this was, of course, the height of the violence, 06, 07. So, I was not what was called a JOCCP, or Joint Junior Officer Cryptologic Program, something. So I hadn't actually studied the business of signals intelligence, and I had been a tactical person and then taught economics, as I explained. And there was a lot of skepticism of why, and I was a major at the time, so I was promotable but was not yet a lieutenant colonel. In that position, the incumbent was a Navy captain. And so there were all these why is this, who is this person, and why is she taking this role, and I don't think she's qualified, and that doesn't seem like a good idea. And the one person who was the biggest supporter was General Alexander, the 3-star, because he'd known me. And he was my biggest supporter, and it ended up being a very, very successful tour. I stayed longer than 6 months. I was there for a full 9 months, and we were able to build and operationalize a capability that made a huge difference. And another one of my mentors, Keith Alexander's classmate, class of 74, Dave Petraeus, was the new commander of the forces in Iraq. And Alexander sort of made this promise that he was going to ensure that the national level capabilities were incredibly relevant to the tactical forces on the ground. So between Petraeus, Alexander, and then head of special operations, Dan McChrystal, class of 76, I was sort of like the person that was bringing NSA's exquisite intelligence capabilities that were very relevant at the time because of the information environment to help operationalize those capabilities for the ground troops. So it ended up being a very transformative experience for me.
What types of technology, if you can talk about it, were the insurgents using against our joint forces?
So you asked about the work in Iraq, And I mean, you'll probably recall that in 2007, the insurgency was at the apex of its strength, sort of violence at an all-time high. And the key challenge was the insurgents, terrorists, were using these crude materials to create homemade bombs. We called them improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, and they were having catastrophic impacts. They were killing thousands of our troops, thousands of Iraqi civilians. And the mission that we were given, my team and I were given, was to essentially build and operationalize this new high technology platform. It was called Real-Time Regional Gateway, or RTRG. It was highly classified, top secret at the time, but declassified probably about 10 years ago. And the idea was to take all of the collection in theater about those terrorist bomb-making networks, so data from cell phones, data from satellites, data from reporting from troops on the ground, take all that information and almost use an early form of AI to be able to integrate it and correlate it and enrich it so that we could make sense, really illuminate those terrorist networks, not in days or weeks when the information was useless, but in hours and minutes, and provide that information to the troops on the ground so that they could effectively pursue and disrupt those terrorist networks. And I remember pretty vividly, the team was sitting in this makeshift van in the middle of a base in Baghdad, Camp Victory. And again, violence at an all-time high, so there was mortar fire and rocket fire and machine gun fire in the near distance. And the team, led by class of 97 Guy Filippelli, led by Guy, small team coding up the system. And it was literally hour by hour, day by day, week by week, fail, 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 fail. And it felt like a lot of pressure because, of course, General Alexander and even General Petraeus was occasionally checking in, like, how's it going? And so ultimately, after about 6 weeks, we were able to get that system up and running successfully, and it provided a capability to the troops on the ground that helped them take thousands and thousands of insurgents off the battlefield and ultimately save thousands and thousands of lives. And that was a really important moment in my career and really helping to shape the rest of the next 20 years of my life, because it was sort of the point where I fell in love with technology. And it really validated this idea of the power of data and the power of imagination, right? There was so much failure, but there was no failure of imagination in that van. And thematically, these were all things that felt like a lot of what I had experienced and what I'd learned was really coming together in the most intense and urgent operational environment. I'll tell you an earlier story. One of the most formative experiences working in the White House the first time was when I went with, probably the last thing I did before I left the White House was when I went with Dr. Rice to the 9/11 Commission hearings, sitting as a backbencher behind her as she testified. And I remember very clearly the words of Tom Kane, who was the co-chairman of the commission, what he said. He said, on that day, and I still remember that very clear September day driving into my office at West Point. He said, on that day, we were unprepared. We did not grasp the magnitude of a threat that had been growing for a considerable period of time. It was a failure of management, a failure of policing, a failure of capability, but above all, a failure of imagination. And that struck me like a lightning bolt, but it also helped to shape a lot of the experiences that I had since that period of time and really up until this day, and was very formative in my time in Iraq. And so, the fact that we were able to build and operationalize that system in the most challenging operational environment, to do it very successfully, gave me a lot of confidence that I could go on and be successful in other high-powered environments.
It's truly amazing. And your team was able to synthesize massive amounts of data Signals intelligence, military intelligence, there's been a lot of analysis over the century, but nothing on this scale had ever been attempted before. Is that right?
It was a brand new system, and it was an experimental system. We had, again, the stakes were really, really, really high, and NSA had always been the, no such agency, never say anything, the agency behind the green door. Even when I spent a summer in Kosovo when I was at West Point. My first summer was in Kosovo before I went off and took the cadets and mids to Vietnam. And even then, it was the NSA was that those guys behind the green door, like, don't bother them. They're the super spooky guys. And Alexander really wanted to change that. He really wanted to make national intelligence relevant to the ground troops, and that is really what we were trying to do, was to take this new system and some incredibly smart technical people and leverage it for the good of the ground troops. And we did a bunch of other things as well. That was the technical system. We also brought in a lot more teams. We surged teams to actually put them with each of the combat brigades. So they had their own expert SIGINT, signals intelligence assets, that could then reach back in both into my team in Baghdad, but also back to the fort. And so there was just this incredible machine that was built, all to ensure that the combat forces could be successful in their mission.
Is it true that the technology had finally caught up to be able to offer this service?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is true. It was pretty groundbreaking, kind of cutting edge technology that was refined with a lot of human brilliance on the teammates that were out there. Were literally coding up the system. But I do think, and again, this was the first time the system was used, and it evolved and then became used in places like Afghanistan and other instantiations. But it was cool to be a part of building and operationalizing this new technology.
And you said a moment ago that this was like the catalyst for your appreciation of technology or love of technology?
Yeah, love affair with technology, it really was, because, again, I'd been in the tactical forces. When I was in Haiti, it was more about kind of briefing the political intelligence. It was the elections then, less about kind of signals intelligence. It was a little bit more of that in Bosnia, but even in Bosnia, it was more about intel to support reconnaissance and surveillance missions in the air, looking for prisoners indicted for war crimes. And so, but this was the first time at the national level where I saw the incredible capabilities of our intelligence apparatus. I mean, NSA is the largest and most powerful intelligence agency in the world. And so really saw, again, the power of these capabilities to make a positive impact in the world and to solve some of our most challenging problems. And that gave me a glimpse into how you can use technology. Again, I mentioned this was almost like, you could think about it, very early AI capabilities, but how that technology could then be used to make a positive difference in many other places. And so that was kind of how my career manifested over the next few years.
Well, I'd like to ask about you and technology. You admitted early on, playing Atari, playing video games, Nintendo. When was your first computer?
I mean, the first computer. My father had computers from when I was very, very young. They were all like the Macintosh. So we would do like the very crude programming on the Macintosh, little things, and kind of just mess around with very basic like word processing type things. But my first actual personal computer was when I got to West Point. The first class to get issued computers was the class of '90. And I believe you can go back and look at the computer museum at West Point, but I think it was the Zenith Z248, which basically probably weighed about 80 pounds and sat like 4 feet high by your desk and had the old floppy disk that, if you wanted to print something, you had to go up to the library or up to the, computer lab with the dot matrix printers and all of that. And, at West Point back then, I guess you took, you had to take basic computer programming, so it was literally like BASIC and Fortran. But I wasn't, I wasn't one of those kind of people, like I was a hacker from the age of 12, it wasn't, my way of hacking was figuring out how to solve like just all kinds of different puzzles and problems, not necessarily through code. That sort of came later in my life, but by virtue of computers were becoming the thing in the 90s, and they played a big role in certainly my experience post leaving the White House and going to NSA. I mean, obviously, as a very technical agency, we became immersed in the world of technology, and that's where kind of led me on my path to cybersecurity and cyber defense.
What followed that tour in Baghdad?
I came back. I was supposed to command a training battalion. I came out on the battalion command list, and it was a training battalion, I think, stationed around Fort Meade, and I really didn't want to do that. I felt like I'd been super operational, doing some really cutting-edge things, and Intel had, for the first time, kind of understood how we were using communications intelligence, both offensively and defensively, and really, as I said, fell in love with this whole idea: how can you use technology to solve our most difficult problems? And because I had done so well in Iraq as the head of the CSG, I again stayed there for 9 months total, didn't come back during that period of time, was literally working 20 hours a day, got the Bronze Star from General Petraeus for that. I came back, and so General Alexander said, I don't think you should go off and command this training battalion. I want you to stand up and command the Army's 1st Cyber Battalion. And so I did, and we built the Army Network Warfare Battalion, ANWB, which went through many iterations now as sort of the 747, I don't even know the number now. It's one of the sevens, and in the brigade at Fort Meade. But so stood up the Army's Network Warfare Battalion, the first, and it was more about computer network exploitation and computer network attack than it was. We ended up developing a company for computer network defense, so sort of like an all-purpose cyber, but it was much more on the exploitation and offensive side. So stood up ANWB in June, I want to say June of 2008. Then was asked by NSA's Director of Signals Intelligence, sort of number 3 at NSA, who I'd become developed a good relationship with because he was impressed by what I was able to do in Iraq, and he set up an opportunity for me at the same time I was commanding the battalion to be the deputy chief for what was called access operations in a place called Tailored Access Operations at NSA, which was sort of famously their center of gravity for elite hacking, obviously foreign targets. So at the same time I was commanding the battalion, I was a deputy chief, key leader in TAO, and actually working in the building, which was kind of cool. So I wasn't just a force provider, I was actually an operator, which was very important for me to deeply understand. It was kind of part of my technical education, not having done my master's in computer engineering or computer science. This was my immersion in education, both in the field and then in the heart of the most technical and incredibly talented people in the world. And so did that, and then I want to say that same fall, there was something called Operation Buckshot Yankee, where it was discovered that the Russians had infiltrated our classified military networks. That then kicked off an effort that was renewed in 2009, which was to build a command, a cyber command. And so by virtue of the fact that I was the commander of the Army Cyber Battalion, General Alexander, who was the director of NSA at the time, chose me and 3 other people, an Army full bird colonel, a Navy captain, and an Air Force colonel, as part of what was called the I-team, the implementation team, to basically build, design, and help to build U.S. Cyber Command, the mission, the vision, the operational structure, how it connected into NSA, because it was supposed to be dual-hatted. Director of NSA dual-hatted as the commander of Cyber Command. So from 2009 to 2010, we worked on that together, and finally were able to effectively get congressional approval for the stand-up of Cyber Command as a sub-unified command with General Alexander as a 4-star, and then stood up the command in 2010, which was fantastic. It's like this building a command, and again, this is a place where a lot of credit is due to General Alexander, because he was he was not a micro. We were doing one of the most consequential things, standing up a command. And he said, you guys are really smart. You're very operational. You have experience. You figure it out. So the four of us, it was one of the highlights of my career, was working with these three other people who are still good friends of mine to stand up an operational command. And to be able to do that and then see it evolve in its capability and capacity to this day as a full-on unified command with real, power, it is, again, like a wonderful opportunity.
And this is huge because it's not just a new command, it is a new combatant command.
Yeah,
at that level,
yeah.
right? With NORDCOM and EUCOM and SOUTHCOM. And
yep, absolutely. Yeah, it started out as a sub-unified to STRATCOM, and then ultimately became a full unified combatant command. Unified command, yeah, I mean cyber as a domain of warfare. So that was another fantastic, opportunity. And all of these are sort of lessons about imagination, lessons about how do you communicate. The key thing for creating Cyber Command was actually, how do you tell a story? We had to convince somewhat dubious, skeptical leaders in the Pentagon and the Congress why you actually needed this new command and why it needed to be built on the foundation of the cryptologic platform, why you had to have this very unique, unheard of, unprecedented dual hat nature between the director of NSA and the commander of Cyber Command. And so making that argument, we created something called the Cyber Storyboard. And we briefed it probably 100+ times, taking this briefing everywhere to help people understand what we were trying to do. So again, it's like, how do you can have a great idea, but unless you can communicate it effectively in a compelling story, it probably is not going to be successful. So again, that was another really important lesson that I took with me throughout the rest of my career.
That lightning bolt moment from the 9/11 hearings about imagination, how did you insert imagination into this new process?
Well, it was how do you be an imaginative storyteller? I remember the first time General Alexander was batting around concepts of us. How do you explain cyber? How do you explain this new mechanism of warfare to people who, don't understand anything about computers or coding or any of that? And we talked about the Battle of Agincourt, thinking about crossbows versus, right, like new technology. And we had, the most important, so we had these fantastic officers. I was the most junior one, they were all 06s. But the most important person on our team actually was this 20-something-year-old young civilian woman named Catherine Groover, who was our graphic artist. So we would bring her in and we'd say, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to explain how packets move, but not bore everybody and not make it super technical and nerdy and all of that, but actually tell the story. And so she created this amazing, animated storyboard where we ultimately had this thing called Dot Millville to talk about, how you actually defend a city under onslaught from cyber forces. And so it was, again, how do you be an imaginative, what's the story? And so it's applied throughout all aspects of my career.
What an amazing opportunity. I'm so glad you were there for that moment.
Yeah, it was really fun. I felt privileged to do it.
And you went on to more active duty work, but this time at the National Security Agency.
Yeah, so we stood up Cyber Command. I was supposed to go to the National War College, but then Stan McChrystal ended up standing down from command in Afghanistan. Petraeus went back in. I had this great relationship with Petraeus in Iraq. I really wanted to support him as he went back from being the CENTCOM commander to commanding Afghanistan again, at a very pivotal moment. And so I asked to deploy to support him. So I went in after having had that experience in Iraq, having helped to stand up U.S. Cyber Command. So I went in sort of as the cyber advisor, did that for a period of about 7 months. Very, very different operational environment. Frankly, because of the immaturity of the comms environment, it was a little bit more difficult to be as effective as we were in Iraq, but still a good learning opportunity for me. But I came back. When I was in Iraq, I didn't take any leave. But when I was in Afghanistan, I came back probably at the mid-tour point. And by that point in time, my son, Jet, was, he was probably, how old was he? He was 5.5. And I had been gone twice. I'd been deployed to Iraq twice. My husband had been deployed to Afghanistan. I came back, and my poor 5.5-year-old son was just madder than hell that I was going to go back. And he was so grown-up, adult-level angry that it affected me so significantly, particularly in the context of losing my little brother, that I just decided I got back to Afghanistan and dropped my paperwork, my retirement paperwork. And I, shortly after came out on the 06 list, but ended up just retiring. And then around that time, I applied to be an NSA civilian. Got picked up to be an NSA senior in SES and to be the deputy for counterterrorism. Ended up working with somebody who I'd worked with in Iraq, probably the best leader at NSA. And so ended up redeploying in April of 2011. Shortly after, went to serve as the deputy for counterterrorism at NSA and was there for 2.5 years in that role. And then after that was selected to be the senior director for counterterrorism for the White House.
Was your son happy that you had gotten out of active duty? And I mean, I know you deployed as a civilian with the NSA, but did you have a more regular working schedule?
Oh, yeah, no, every time I deployed with NSA, I was in the military. So
Yeah.
I was not, as a civilian, I had much greater flexibility, even though when I was at the White House, frankly, so counterterrorism was not supposed to be a big thing in the second term of the Obama administration. Some will remember it was supposed to be the pivot to Asia. But then I got there in October of 2013, and shortly afterward, like in 2014, ISIS sort of started to manifest, and then we saw the movement of al-Qaeda veterans from Afghanistan into Syria, the rise of ISIS, then the fall of Mosul in Iraq, and then CT became the big thing again. And I got much more people on my team, and counterterrorism became like sort of the center of gravity for policy in the second Obama administration, and so was part of all of that. So, I ended up living downtown in DC at a friend's apartment and then would go home on the weekends. So, did not end up seeing my son that much, but at least I was not in a foreign country where it just felt unbearable, right? I could go home, I could go to his soccer games, things like that. But that contributed to, I loved that job in the White House was amazing, and I had an opportunity had such a great team to build a capability that had a real impact and ultimately helping to defeat ISIS's caliphate, and then building what I'm probably most proud about was the new hostage policy in the aftermath of the horrible beheadings of journalists and aid workers in the summer of 2014. But, at the end of 2016, I decided I was not going back to NSA. I was not staying in the government. I was going to go off and go to the private sector. So.
Before that call to work for the Obama administration, had you decided, I'm going to stick with this NSA job? You'd spent a lot of time at Fort Meade.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally decided I was going to do that. We bought a house. Bought a house right outside, like a couple miles outside of NSA in Hanover, Maryland. And much to the chagrin of my husband, who's a diehard Virginian from Richmond. But no, I thought I was spending the rest of my, active working life at the National Security Agency. But then, got selected for this White House job that was so transformational to me. And at the end of that period of time, just didn't, General Alexander had moved on. There was a new director, there was a new deputy director, and I wasn't sure where I was going to go back and feel like a real sense of purpose and be able to make an impact. And I knew I wanted to, this time, really spend more direct time with my son because my son was turning 13. So most people don't go to an investment bank to spend more time with their family, but they do if you're the head of counterterrorism during ISIS, the rise and fall of ISIS. So we ended up going to New York City. I joined Morgan Stanley to be the global head of their cybersecurity fusion center. Was there from 2017 to 2021, which was a challenging transition for my whole family, sort of uprooting everybody. My husband was unemployed. My son went from his nice little parochial school to a private school up in the Bronx, and I was starting at a financial services firm, which I taught economics, but I didn't really know anything about banking or the type of technology that banks use, and so it was another immersion. But in the first, probably 6 months was really challenging. But I found my way and I found my tribe and was able to create something that was really effective, really, really special. And ended up just absolutely loving the firm, loving the people there, and created this global cybersecurity fusion centers around the world in Glasgow and Singapore, New York and Baltimore, and then was asked on the success of that model to build something called the Fusion Resilience Center, which was essentially an all-hazards evolution of the Cyber Fusion Center. So the idea was, stood this thing up in December of 2019, and the mission was to understand, plan, prepare for, respond to, recover, and learn from the full range of disruptions to the firm, from cyber attacks and technology outages to geopolitical unrest and weather events. And I remember writing the mission statement in December of 2019. It said, and low probability, high impact events like terrorist attacks and pandemics. To which my boss, the head of technology, then blamed me for the pandemic. So that was December of 2019, before we knew anything about the rise of COVID-19. But by February of that time, as the head of Morgan Stanley's Fusion Resilience Center, I was the co-lead for our response to COVID, working with our chief medical officer, Dave Stark, and then a fantastic team of teammates. And that actually was a terrible time, but one of the best experiences ever, because I could use a lot of what I had learned in my time in the military as a crisis manager, dealing with, and even at the White House as the head of counterterrorism, and apply it to a very different environment where people need somebody who's very good in intense times, but still calm, can communicate well, and can sort of see big problems and help to synthesize them into solutions. And so that ended up being very, very successful, and a great learning opportunity for me as well, and probably the best preparation to be the director of CISA, which was my next job.
Yeah, tell us about that phone call. Who called and what was the pitch?
Oh, well, so it was sort of a series of phone calls. Actually, I was, so all through 2020, I was, again, the co-lead for how the firm was managing the response to COVID, and how we did the return to work, how we made sure that the business was still able to thrive, how we protected the business in a world of remote work where cyber threats were much more active. And then in August of 2020, I got an outreach from a friend of mine, Avril Haines, who had been the Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration, and who had also gone to New York City to work at Columbia University. And she lived a block away from me downtown in the financial district. And she had taken over as the head of the Biden-Harris transition team. So even before the election, they set up something like a transition team to help give whoever wins the election kind of a running start. And she said, look, I'd really like you to be the cyber policy lead for the transition team, because she'd seen me at the White House and she knew I was leading this cyber effort at Morgan Stanley. And I said, Avril, I just can't. It's crazy. We're working 20 hours a day. And, separate from this, I have my other operational mission from running, the response to COVID. And about a week later, Avril's the nicest, smartest person in the world. It's very hard to say no to. So about a week later, I said, okay. She hadn't found anybody yet. I said, okay, I'll do it. So sort of at night, moonlighting in this job, I was the cyber policy lead for the transition team, working with, I want to say, two other folks that one who I'd met recently, another who I'd known, who was another Army officer who I'd worked with earlier, Sean Lonergan, and Tim, whose last name I don't remember right now. But so we had a nice little team working on cyber policy, developed like the roadmap for the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and and then the election happened, and he got elected, and so we wanted to create a plan that we thought was going to be usable, And then SolarWinds happened, which was a major Russian incursion on the software supply chain that impacted a lot of federal government agencies. And so that actually elevated the profile of cyber security on the transition team, where I wouldn't say it was a top priority, but that really elevated it. And so that was very interesting because it was also relevant to my time at Morgan Stanley. So I got sort of this dual look and, briefed both the vice president and the president-elect at the time on this operational matter. That was really interesting. And then they were deciding who was going to take roles in the new administration. And so I was originally asked to be another role on the National Security Council doing cyber, and I ended up turning that down because I'd been in that role before, and it wasn't something that I thought I was going to advance and learn very much in that role. And so I ended up saying no to that. Then they were looking at me for a role that was newly created called the National Cyber Director role, and actually that was the one that I thought they were going to ask me to do. And I wasn't actually that excited to do that role, and sort of had decided with my family that I was not going to take that role. I really enjoyed doing what I was doing at Morgan Stanley, and had just actually been selected to be their head of firm resilience, so another very senior role.
And you working for the new administration would mean another move.
Would be a move back to DC, and I love New York City, so I thought it was a good experience for all of our family. Anyway, so I didn't want this National Cyber Director role, but then in April, like April 8th or something, I got a call from somebody in PPO called the Presidential Policy Office, who said, we want you to take this job as the director of CISA. And I said, well, where's that coming from? I think you've already chosen a different person who I knew as the director of CISA. And they said, no, we've changed our mind. And I said, well, that doesn't sound right to me, because that's not what I've been focused on in terms of a potential role. I think you were looking for this other thing, and I don't actually want to do that other thing, so I think I want to stay in New York. But they said, well, we really want you to do this role, and we don't plan to offer it to anybody else at this time. And so I called the person who was supposed to be the new, Secretary of Homeland Security. He was going to be the boss at the time, and I talked to him, and so ultimately, and then the person called me back, and he's like, and we need a decision by tomorrow. So I was like, oh my goodness. So I talked to a bunch of mentors of mine, and ultimately I agreed to take the job because it was so different, and it was much more of a continuity between the job that I had at Morgan Stanley in terms of defending critical infrastructure. And it was so new. It was like creating and building something that was very operational. It wasn't like a policy role like the National Cyber Director or strategy role. It was a very operational role with thousands of people and an ability to create real partnerships as America's cyber defense agency. And so I agreed to do it, and then a couple of days later they announced it and had to go through the confirmation hearing and all of that, and then ended up at CISA having to move the family back. My beloved son decided he wanted to go to boarding school, and his boarding school, just by, again, this other theme is this coincidence, God's way of remaining anonymous. The boarding school that he ended up going to was 15 minutes from where we lived in Arlington. Went to Episcopal High School in Alexandria. So I was fine with that kind of boarding school that was only 15 minutes away from my son. And then ended up, started, and I was confirmed on July, 12th of 2021, and then ended up being sworn in the next day. And that started like 3.5, almost 4 years, amazing opportunity to build and operationalize America's Cyber Defense Agency. It was a true honor and privilege to build a team which was ultimately about 10,000 people total, $3 billion agency dealing with some of the most urgent and intense and dangerous threats to U.S. national critical infrastructure, and to build a team that was just incredibly talented to make a real impact for the country.
Truly amazing. Just like you had built a team for those forward deployed units.
Yeah, I mean, I would
overseas.
say, if I have a superpower, it's, being able to use and leverage imagination to build amazing teams, to be able to solve really, really hard problems. And that's been an evolution. Like, I think the leader that I am today was not the leader I was when I was a platoon leader in 125 MI. I would say, my general view now as somebody who's, a lot older is every day is an opportunity to be a better human, a better leader, a better mom, a better wife, a better parent, a better sister. And that's also been an evolution in what I've been able to bring to the teams that I've built.
And you enjoyed your time at the White House, as stressful, as hectic as it was?
First time or second time?
Second time.
Yeah, it was an amazing opportunity. I mean, very, very challenging, but I had an incredible team of people who I'm still close to. And the most difficult problems, I mean, this was the global terrorist attacks all over the world. Worked on preventing terrorists from using technology to operationalize and radicalize followers. So, again, worked very closely with the chief technology officer. We actually had a whole thing where we worked with the technology companies to prevent terrorists from using their platforms. That was the other connection deeply with the tech world, which was, fantastic. And then, great privilege to work on the hostage issue. I was part of the failed hostage rescue attempt to go bring back the brave journalists and aid workers like Jim Foley. And then after their brutal murders, the president asked my team and I to build a new hostage policy. We worked on that for 9 months across the interagency with our international partners, but most importantly with families of hostages, some of whom had lost their kids to brutal executions and beheadings. And people like Diane Foley, people like Deborah Tice helped us build a much more effective and humane hostage policy that has remained throughout the Obama, the first Trump, the Biden, and the second Trump administration. That has been one of the sources of continuity. And since we put that new policy in place in June of 2015, we have seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Americans return safely. And that, I think, is probably it's right up there with what I'm most proud of, and then ended up going on to receive the American Hostage Freedom Award from the Foley Foundation, became a board member for the Foley Foundation, and, it was a really important mission to be a part of, because you are helping to deal with some of the most vulnerable people in some of the scariest places and bring comfort to their families and help to try and bring them back safely.
This is a wonderful legacy.
Thank you.
So what are you up to now?
Well, this is my year of living dangerously. My first time not being fully employed, which was by design. As I explained, when I left the White House the second time, I jumped right into that new job at Morgan Stanley, and so I wanted to be very deliberate about taking some time off to figure out what's the thing that I want to focus on. And so I've been doing sort of a mix of things, from some teaching at Oxford to some advising a couple private companies and a couple public companies, and a lot of keynote speaking. It's what I love to do. How do you communicate effectively? How do you tell a story? How do you land a message with a variety of different audiences so it has an impact? And in particular, in technology, people can geek out and confuse people with a bunch of technical terms. But if you are able to tell a story effectively and make it land in a way that really resonates with your audience, whether it's an audience of Vietnam veterans or an audience of sixth graders, that's a special thing to be able to do, and it's all about connecting with people. So that's been really fun. And then I'm sure the new year will bring new opportunities and new challenges.
Well, I'm excited to hear about all your next chapters.
Thank you.
But a wonderful life of, as you said, imagination and connections and amazing stories.
Thank you.
Is there anything about your life, your career, that we haven't asked about that you want to tell?
Well, I think I gave you most of my good stuff. No, I think I've kind of probably hit almost everything. No.
Well, Jen, again, we want to thank you on behalf of the Veterans Museum for telling us your story. And I want to thank you for your service.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. And not just to the Army, but, to the American people.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for what you all are doing.